All right, I think we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Eric Ramanathan, Executive Director of the Program on the Legal Profession. Thank you for this wonderful turnout. Thank you all for coming today. We have some terrific speakers today, and I'll give them an introduction in a moment. But first, I just wanted to talk quickly about a couple things at the program. I am well into my 7L year here at Harvard Law School, and it's time for me to go and focus on my ever-increasing board and consulting portfolio, and I've decided to step away from this role. Very pleased today to introduce Derek Davis, who's taking over as Executive Director of the program. I'm also very pleased that Derek, like me, while we're both have spent a large part of our careers in the private sector, Derek also has a tremendous public interest and public sector set of interests and experience working on, whether it's working on blue ribbon commissions for Governor Patrick, or serving as chairman of the board of Cambridge College, and everything that organization has to do with access to higher ed. He's very, very interested in these issues, and I'm sure he'll share my commitment for continuing to do programming that's not just about private sector lawyering, but also public interest lawyering and what that really means at the deepest levels. Real quick before I introduce our speakers, we continue to have information on student grant programs, which we run throughout the year for people who want to do writing projects, do empirical research, need funding for that. And I also wanted to point out, we wrote on the sideboards the email of our program coordinator, Rachel Gibson. We're trying to get off the ground some more student contributions. Hopefully many of you follow our PLP Pulse newsletter, which is kind of an aggregator of some of the more pithy and interesting news about the legal profession. We'd love to have more student input on what your legal education experiences are, internship experiences, things like that. We'd love to have more public interest voices in the mix too. If you're interested at all in getting involved, I promise it wouldn't be a hugely burdensome thing. We'd love to have you, so please email Rachel if you're interested in that. And now for the main event, we've been working with the Summer Theory Institute for quite a few years now, and Nisha Agarwal is one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of that group for many years running. She's also deputy director and co-founder of the Center for Popular Democracy. And we also have our other speaker is an alum of this fine program. Cara Suvall is a public defender at Bronx Defenders. And we're so pleased that they could make the trip up from New York today and continue this great tradition and telling you a little bit more about some of the substantive theory behind what they're trying to do.
So thank you, Eric, and Program on Legal Professions. Thank you, Hakeem. I'm Nisha Agarwal. This is Cara. I'm really psyched to see this turnout for the first day back from spring break, right? It's the first day back from spring break, and this building is amazing. Definitely was not here in law school, and that's very sad. But as Eric mentioned, I am the Deputy Director at the Center for Popular Democracy and helped start a program that we're going to talk about called the Summer Theory Institute, which the Program on the Legal Profession has been a huge supporter of, and we see some alums in the room other than Cara as well, which is very exciting. But maybe what we'll start with is I'll just tell you a little bit about my own sort of professional path and where social theory and why social theory has sort of fit into that professional path, and Cara will do the same. And then it would be great to dig in on a discussion about the role of theory, social theory in particular, in public interest practice and why it's important for practitioners to be critical thinkers and reflective about the practice. So after I graduated from HLS in 2006 and moved to New York, was on a Skadden Fellowship at an organization called the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And my leaving law school, I knew I wanted to do a few things. I was sort of interested in civil rights law, wanted to do law and organizing, and so sort of be a lawyer in support of base building and membership-based organizations. I was passionate about healthcare issues, and I just wanted to live in New York. So that's how I sort of landed in where I did in my job. And what I did for over 5 years was essentially partner with community-based organizations around New York City on a range of different racial justice campaigns in the healthcare sector. So mainly legislative work. It was very little litigation, though I did some litigation. But the idea was essentially to work with community-based organizations to figure out what are the gaps in the law, where are the rules not working for folks, and then how do we organize and mobilize and draft new rules and move those rules through the city legislature and through the state legislature. And so that was pretty much an amazing dream job. So if you all are looking for summer employment or postgraduate employment and thinking about law and organizing, I would highly recommend New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. It sort of expanded what I thought I would ever be doing as a lawyer. So there was a lot of work in the community sort of explaining laws that actually don't make a lot of sense to folks who will then say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why don't I have the right to sue when my rights have been violated? You know, things that we talk about in the abstract in the law school classroom were sort of coming alive, and we were strategizing together about how to change those things. Did a lot of media advocacy, a lot more translating of the law into sort of the public domain. That was very exciting. I think most importantly, feeling like I was advocating in front of lawmakers with decision makers on behalf of communities that otherwise would not have that sort of legal support was a real privilege. So that's sort of where I was for 5.5 years. And at that point, I was working very closely with an organization called Make the Road New York, which is a membership-based organization in New York City of about now 15,000 low-income New Yorkers who are members, predominantly immigrant community members, and worked closely with the staff there. Really felt like started talking to the founder of that organization and to their legal director about how we need more of this kind of law and organizing, more of the sort of community-driven state and local policy work, more power building in low-income communities of color than we have now. And that is what was the genesis, sort of on the park bench in Washington Square Park in New York, of this new organization called the Center for Popular Democracy. We are the national sister organization to Make the Road New York and work with community-based organizations and progressive unions around the country to drive a state and local policy agenda on immigrant rights, on racial justice, on economic justice issues. And so now my work is similar. I do a lot more kind of legislative work, continue to do the policy work. I'm also thinking about building an organization. So a lot more thinking about budgeting and financing and the stuff that I never really thought about when I was in law school, and how you build an organization, build a staff, how you essentially are a kind of entrepreneur and a small business owner in a way in the field of social justice and how you do that. So happy to talk more about that. But throughout this entire sort of period, something that's been very important to me has been a community of peers that I've been able to form around social theory and thinking critically about public interest law at each step of the way. Huge questions have come up about, is this the right way to be approaching public interest work? Is it the way I want to be practicing? What does it mean to be a lawyer on behalf of community? What should we be doing? Like, what are the goals here? And one of the strategies that I've helped to sort of develop with Cara and with other colleagues and folks in New York has been this notion of getting together every once in a while, reading social theory, engaging with that theory in a deep way, and then having a conversation with your peers about what does that perspective on the world tell me about my practice, and how does it change my practice, how does it shape it, how does it help me from step back and reflect on it. And so we'll talk a lot more about this, but that started with both a kind of practitioner reading group that my friend Jocelyn, we both graduated together, and I started in New York, that continues to this day, and many HLS students, former alums, are participating in it, and in the creation of the Summer Theory Institute. So a little bit about me.
So briefly about myself, I graduated in 2010. I'm a staff attorney, public defender at the Bronx Defenders, where I've been for the past 2.5 years. I started out there on a partial fellowship from the Initiative for Public Interest Law at Yale, focusing on education needs of young clients charged with misdemeanors. Then I went on to sort of general practice within the office, and now me and one other attorney in my office have developed a practice within Bronx Defenders called the Adolescent Defense Project, focusing on representing 14 and 15-year-olds who are bumped up to adult criminal court from juvenile family court for certain violent felonies, as well as 16-year-olds who disgracefully in New York are all tried as adults even for really minor offenses, one of only 2 states in the whole country that still does that. Thinking how to represent them even on the most minor offenses, even on a trespass offense, if they fall into a certain high need category. So for example, homelessness, actively presenting with mental health issues, on juvenile probation, and if the arrest happened in school, certain other factors like that. I had the wonderful fortune, my 1L summer, of being part of the inaugural year of the Summer Theory Institute. And I have to say, Nisha and Jocelyn, who co-founded it, are 2 of my heroes, people that I really look up to in my public interest practice. And it's a really valuable thing to have people like that as you're planning to go out into the workforce, people that you can hope to model and learn from, and hopefully partner with, which I had the pleasure of doing with Nisha this past summer when we co-facilitated the Summer Theory Institute this past summer. And if I could just out our participants from last summer. Yeah. Nice. It's wonderful to see you guys. And at the end, we'll talk about if people are doing 1L or 2L public interest internships in New York City this summer, we would love to have you apply to the Summer Theory Institute for this coming summer, and we'll touch on that at the end. So in law school, you hear a lot about how you are being trained to think like a lawyer, right? You're all starting to think like lawyers. And that means something like having analytical rigor, being able to see a problem, issue, spot, if you will, break it down into component pieces and rationally work through it, something like that. And so Nisha and I wanted to talk about a piece that we think is missing in what a lot of the training is that you get in law school and even in internships, a piece that's missing and is really essential to public interest practice. And I've been struggling with what exactly we call that piece, but I would like to call it something like moral thinking or ethical criticism or something like that. It's a way to step back from practice and reflect on what you're doing, think about how it fits into your larger goals and what kind of effect it has on the world. And it sounds almost too simple to be a brilliant new addition, but it really is. I think so much of public interest practice, we're so pressed for time. We are so resource strapped, and we are so dedicated to doing what we're doing on a day-to-day basis that it's, even though a lot of people are motivated by morals or ethics, it's a piece that's often missing. And what I learned through my summer participating in the Summer Theory Institute is that it's actually something that can be learned and developed. It's not just like, do you have a moral instinct, yes or no, okay, go out into the world. There's actually a way of thinking and critiquing that you can learn and develop, and I think that my public interest practice has really benefited from engaging in the Summer Theory Institute, and then also, even if you don't have a Summer Theory Institute to join in the city you're going to, thinking of ways to reflect on your practice, to create room for yourself, to critique your practice. And that doesn't necessarily mean being critical of your practice, but really stepping back and thinking, how can I challenge myself to put my practice more in line with my ideals? And it's something that if we're not doing, I think you can easily sort of stagnate in your practice, end up feeling burnt out, which you hear a lot of people talking about in public interest law, feeling disconnected, feeling disenchanted. So hopefully some of what we talk about today will help combat some of that. Okay.
Great. So I'm gonna, I think before I sort of talk a little bit more about this issue, why moral thinking, I'm gonna give a heads up to our alum participants to maybe start thinking. We may call you out to say why you think, engaging with theory over the course of a summer, perhaps past that point, was helpful in terms of your public interest practice. But I want to just underscore one thing that Cara said, is just this idea of burnout and community. So right now I work a lot right now because we're trying to build an organization and run campaigns around the country. And the notion of coming home at the end of a long day when your email is blowing up and there's like a million crises going on, And you to sit down with like Michel Foucault or like whoever and like curl up on the couch and start like doing that may sound crazy, and it may sound like, why on earth would you do something like that? What is the value to you as a practitioner? Why not, you know, spend that little bit of extra time doing work in furtherance of sort of your clients and the communities that you're working for? So part of the reason for that is because truly, and I think you have to do it to believe what we're saying, but stepping back and having the space to reflect in a way that is, more than just complaining at the water cooler and, sort of talking over beers in the bar, but actually having a sort of structured way to step back and reflect on the work that you're doing through the lens of somebody else who spent a lot of time, whether you agree with what they say or not, thinking about how the world should be, is so enormously invigorating and helpful. So every week when we would go to Summer Theory Institute, I would show up pretty exhausted. Like, oh my gosh, we're gonna spend 2 hours, we're gonna be eating pizza, we're gonna be talking about like whoever, Gayatri Spivak, who's very hard to read, and talking about that and parsing through that. And I left after those 2 hours feeling like I was part of a community of folks that really energized me and that I could have a kind of really deep and engaged conversation with about the reasons why you go into public interest law in the first place. Why, how, when, who, like all of those questions that I'm sure you don't feel like you have the space to have those conversations in all of sort of the law school, the day-to-day of law school, and certainly not in the day-to-day of public interest practice. And so the idea is to carve out that space. It's like exercise, but more fun. Like you have to, it feels good when you do it, you have to do it, and it actually is like enjoyable while you're doing it as compared with some forms of exercise. So I think that's very important. And maybe what I can do is now turn it over if any of our alums want to sort of jump in and say what their experience was like, and feel free to be critical too, if it was horrible and Nisha's, not being fair and saying that you felt invigorated at the end of 2 hours.
I thought it was a super valuable experience for a number of reasons. Part of it is the fact that most of the rest of my time was over the summer was spent in groups of people, often that I knew, through the internship I was doing, and so we all sort of shared this sensitivity to public interest issues. But when it's a group that's assembled around a single subject area like that, it's not necessarily a group that's handpicked for having these expansive conversations. Mm-hmm. Whereas this Summer Theory Institute group came together specifically because we want to be talking about these bigger issues. We want to be really thinking hard, even when we're not, writing a brief or whatever. And the other value of it, I thought, was just sort of recontextualizing my practice, both in terms of these other people, even though they're all doing public interest stuff, are doing very different things from what I am. And so what can I learn from those practices and what can I share with them about mine? And also, there's a lot of recontextualization coming out of the readings themselves. Most of the readings are not public interest lawyers, are not written by public interest lawyers, and yet what can we take from these very abstract or very sort of high theory writings to sort of see our own practices in a different light? It was very valuable.
I thought it was valuable because I think doing some public interest work, you hear a lot of different voices that are very unstructured coming at you that sort of influence how you think about what you're doing, and some of them might be snipes from people saying are you actually doing something that's living out your values, or are you doing that from the right place, or people who might say are you actually doing that effectively and stuff. But it's kind of an unstructured sort of discourse that's sort of out there, and this is a way of examining these things in a very structured way where you get to where it's not structured toward a certain conclusion that oh yes, we're doing the right thing, but it's structured in the sense of that it's actually a place to actually consider a lot of these voices that are out there and look at them very hard, and in a way that we hear where a lot of people coming from different directions are contributing to that. And so I think it was really nice to have every week that sort of voice sorting through these disparate voices and actually having a conversation that we're participating in.
And I think it was very helpful for helping to refine why I was doing what I was doing in the first place. I think one reading was really interesting. It said the term social justice is dangerous because we don't actually know what it means, but we all talk about achieving it. You know, and actually really thinking about it's like, okay, and I started watching people when they talk about social justice, like, well, which social justice are you talking about? And, you know, that kind of, it's sort of like, you know, the sort of thing you do in college, that sort of reflection, like, what does this word mean? What is, you know, like you start picking apart things, but you realize that's really important. We don't do that at law school, but we're focused on action and work, but not necessarily on that critical reflection. I think it's really crucial for public interest lawyers because there are inevitably moments when you're forced to reflect or think about the work you're doing, why you're doing it. We're not choosing the easy path. We're taking low salaries for big hours with frustrating work. You're wondering what you're achieving at all. At some point, you'll be faced with those questions, and so it's really helpful to have a theoretical framework to be able to kind of cling to, so that you're sure of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that you're doing the right thing. And you can become critical of systems where people have good intentions, but maybe are doing more harm, or they're causing a kind of harm they don't realize they're causing. You know, disempowering people by doing the work themselves instead of including people. So it was really helpful, and a lot of the lessons have sort of kind of been rattling around my brain throughout the year, and at my internship, and then at the work I've been doing this year too.
Right. Those are some really helpful reflections. I think that our wonderful participants pointed out a few things that I also have been thinking about ever since I participated in my 1L summer and had the pleasure of participating again this last summer. It's really hard as a new lawyer to create this space. I think that when you're new to an organization, you know, even if it's an organization that you 100% believe in, there's a period of sort of ideological indoctrination, which I think is healthy and necessary to some extent, but I think you spend so much time learning the basics of your job, getting acculturated to the culture and the ethos of your office, that it's easy to try to take that on yourself as your own ethics. And it's really, I think it's an especially important thing for young lawyers to be aware of as you enter the workplace. So, I mean, as a staff person, just like as an intern, you spend most of your time with people at your workplace. You just do. That's most of your public interest community. And if you're fortunate, it's going to be a supportive, positive public interest community. But if that's your only public interest community, then I think you end up getting sort of stuck in this space where you're generally focused on reinforcing the ideology of your workplace and the culture of your workplace, or complaining about it, depending if you like it or not, but still using that as the paradigm to either accept or reject. So we're going to talk in a second about some techniques that we use, and then we'll have a discussion about sort of other techniques about how do you create that space and really kind of get back sort of back to basics. So as just one example that I struggle with as an example of I love my organization. I think that a lot of its guiding ethics and principles are ones that I do fully and honestly embrace, but they're not enough for me to find fulfillment in my work. So a good example is that I would say at my workplace, the ultimate value is what we call being client-centered. And the ultimate question that we ask to be client-centered is, what does your client want? That's a pretty simple sounding principle, but it's actually pretty profound. So you're deciding between two theories, you're deciding to file a motion, you're deciding to go with a certain strategy or not. You're not ethically bound in all of those to actually consult your client directly. There are certain decisions that your client can make, the lawyer can make. In our office, the ultimate value is, what does your client want? So sometimes I'll find myself having a conversation, I'm not sure which way to go, and then a coworker says, what's your client want? And you're like, of course, thank you, that provided some clarity. So that's sort of an overriding value in my office. But if that were the only value that was driving my work, I don't really see how that value would get me to a social justice goal that truly resonates with me. Unless you're one of these people that's like, it's all about the process, which some people are, but most people aren't. I just really believe in the criminal justice system, and if I do what my client wants, the DA does what's best for them, justice will win out. That's not how I think, and I think that's how very few people working in the criminal justice system think. So I think that's just a good example of a value in my workplace that I respect, that I adopt, and that I follow on a daily basis. But if that was the end of my inquiry, I think I would, if I didn't feel that my work was in other ways connected to a broader social justice struggle, a broader class and race-based understanding of oppression in current day society, I don't think that I would find the work that I do as fulfilling as I do. So that's just one example of how you can get kind of stuck in an organization's ideology. And if you don't revisit what those underlying values are, I think you can really get burnt out and lose your way a lot more easily.
Okay, so here you are. You're in law school. I guess I should talk a little bit about like the strategies for how to kind of develop these critical thinking skills. So when I was in law school, I was my friend Jocelyn and I were simultaneously enrolled. She was in CJI, and I was at the Legal Aid Bureau, Yale Legal Aid Bureau. And we were both sort of basically working, full-time jobs representing clients, and then also were simultaneously enrolled in a course that I don't think is still offered, but should be, called Theory Workshop, which was taught by Chris Dasan and Lucy White. And that was actually a course in which all we read was theory. It was not legal. It was also not sort of oriented in any direction. It was kind of like, let's read Pierre Bourdieu and see what what implications that might have for our public interest practice, or our commitments to social justice. So Jocelyn and I were sort of simultaneously pivoting between being in criminal court or housing court and then coming to HLS and having these like very lofty conversations about social theory in our class. And what we found was both that doing the sort of jumping between the theoretical space and the practice space was really good for us. We found ourselves having these like sort of separate conversations with ourselves, with our friends about like, well, what am I doing in the Legal Aid Bureau? What do I want to do with my life? Like, have I stopped to think about this, or have I just gotten so rigidly in the mindset of I'm a public interest student at HLS and I will do good no matter what, without thinking about it critically, that I didn't feel like I had as many of my bearings as I needed. So that was a very positive experience. And what we also felt as we were approaching graduation is that we have to choose between a kind of path of practice and of being a practitioner and a professional versus being on the path of theory and of having space to be able to think and write and read and do all those other things that we enjoy doing as Harvard Law students. And that was troubling to us, to have to feel like we have to make that choice, and it wasn't clear why one would have to make that choice. So in reading some of the theories that we read in the theory workshop, they're constantly talking about breaking down dichotomies and challenging the kind of boundaries between things, and we realized we were just sort of falling into these boundaries between kind of the school environment and the practice environment and what each of those entailed. So we graduated, moved to New York together, and formed a practitioner reading group. We call it Critical Brooklyn. Surprise, we were living in Brooklyn. And we, put posters up in coffee shops and, I think posted on Craigslist, come join our theory reading group. We didn't know if it would be me and Jocelyn and maybe a friend of ours who felt bad, or what the deal would be. But we ended up actually having a lot of people who were interested in coming together, and not just lawyers, practitioners, social justice practitioners, and professionals of a variety of sorts, who did actually want to get together over, cheese and a bottle of wine and read theory in the midst of their busy practice experiences and talk about what it meant for them as professionals in the world. And so that group now continues to exist. It started 5-6 years ago and continues. It's not called Critical Brooklyn anymore because there's people from Manhattan involved now. But there is now this sort of ongoing group, and in doing that, we realize all the benefits that we experienced of sort of jumping between theory workshop and being practitioners were in many ways sort of magnified even in actually doing this as practitioners. Were we having the same kind of conversations that folks in graduate school or PhD candidates have about the theory? Definitely not. Am I confident that we understood the texts exactly how we were supposed to understand the text? Probably not, but that's not the point, right? The point was to have this sort of really deep conversation with the text and with the theory, with our own rich experiences as practitioners, being the thing that was doing the guiding and helping us with the processing. So doing that, we realized, well, okay, we can pull this off as practitioners. How do you start to kind of develop the skills, the capacities in law school? So we pitched this idea of doing the Summer Theory Institute. We just made it up and talked to Alexa at Opia, talked to the folks at the program on the legal profession and said, hey, this is an idea we have for public interest, students that are working in internships from HLS that are in public interest in New York for a summer. Give us a little bit of money, give them some stipends, we'll have some food, we'll make the reading list, we'll get together, we'll talk about it. And so we did the same thing. We sort of started advertising. We thought, is anybody going to sign up for this thing or not the first summer? And happily, Cara and 12, 13 other HLS students did actually sign up for the inaugural summer, and we found that, again, the sort of values of community, of being able to sort of step back once a week, be able to think critically about the work in the context of really short readings, so like 30-page short theory readings, and just sort of talking about that. And Cara, actually, we had brought copies of a reading list, just so you have a sense of at least how summer theory works. For the practitioner reading group, we read whole books, or kind of read whole books. We found that the same value was there, and there were these additional benefits of having law students hear from each other about the different public interest experiences that they were having, and getting a sense of the range of different ways in which one can be a lawyer in the world, and being able to have a sort of community of folks where you can come back and say, this thing happened in my internship today. I don't know how I feel about that in terms of the model. Or being able to say, this is an incredible new model I just got exposed to. Did you know that this is out there even as a lawyer? So being able to have those conversations as well as the kind of bigger picture conversations. And it's really ever since then that summer theory has been going and continuing, and hopefully will continue into the future in terms of building that community and developing those sorts of critical thinking skills.
Yeah, and I think that one important thing about the texts involved in Summer Theory Institute is that they are not legal theory, and they're not focused on a particular subject area. So for me, I contrast the types of readings we do in Summer Theory Institute, which are normative, value-laden, non-legal texts, talking about a wide range of things, versus I participated in a reading group that I helped put on last summer for interns in my office, where we were reading more, maybe it's not fair to call them indoctrination texts, but like we read chapters from The New Jim Crow, for example, which is a fabulous book, but if you get into a certain setting, some people are like, this is crazy, this is blowing my mind. But in certain settings, like if you're an intern at Bronx Defenders, everyone's like, yeah, of course, it's a system of mass incarceration designed to exploit black labor and black people. It was kind of like, of course, we all agree. I hate mass incarceration. Me too. It kind of this sort of reiterating of shared values, and it's valuable to read somebody else express it so much better than I could, and in a really convincing way. But it's not challenging in the way. So we found our discussions being like, I agree with this part. I agreed with this part even more. Which is different, very different. Very, very different from the kinds of conversations that we would have in Summer Theory Institute. So just to kind of highlight that as like the types of things, that these are sort of challenging readings that really go to foundational ways of seeing the world, as opposed to, poverty's bad, racial inequality is bad, things that we all agree with, but and can learn about, but don't necessarily challenge us in the same way.
And I think that the thing I would add to that is the sort of taking the risk. It's like sort of part of it is taking a risk to feel the discomfort, right? So like putting yourself in a situation. So to give an example, one of the texts that we read in our practitioner reading group, and then also read in Summer Theory Institute and have been reading, is by Chantal Mouffe. And it's called On Politics. It's part of a series of books by theorists that are meant to actually be for more popular consumption than what Chantal Mouffe normally writes. And she essentially takes this very right-wing philosopher and talks about how some of his thinking about politics and about groups actually should be embraced by, or at least considered by, folks on the left. And I remember reading it when I was at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and I was doing a campaign with a group of folks who are limited English proficient on trying to get more interpretation and translation services in the city's provision of government services from the city. And the way we were talking about that campaign was about access, right? So we should be able to access services on equal terms to English speakers, provide us with these, services to be able to do that. Reading Moof, and reading about this notion, she talks a lot about group identity and about groups having sort of political identities, where it's not just about individuals aggregated, but it's about kind of collective identities that are then jostling and not necessarily in sort of happy, deliberative ways in the political environment, really made me rethink, just for 2 hours, but beyond that in the course of my work, about how we were framing the campaign that we were working on. So why isn't this about identity? Why is it about equality? Why is it about access? Why isn't it about an identity of a linguistic community to actually be on equal terms to others, instead of just saying, let us in, and sort of knocking on the door, but actually saying, like, we are here, we want to be on the same sort of par as English speakers, and sort of the shift that made in terms of the way I thought about how radical our demands were or not in the context of the campaign. Did that mean we changed the campaign documents or we presented it in any way that was different? No, not necessarily, but it made me think about the work that I was doing in ways that were very different. Fast forwarding to now, there is a lot of discussion in sort of organizing circles about kind of deliberation, and can you convince somebody just through talking to them, essentially, in politics, to see your point of view. And what I'm discovering in the course of my work, where I only work with groups now, I have no individual clients, and it is all explicitly political, is that Moof, again, is coming back into my way of thinking in terms of, this is not about individuals having the right to process, to being able to sort of speak in the public domain on equal terms as everyone else. That's important, but it's also about groups being able to exercise power in a kind of antagonistic, sometimes cold, and sometimes sort of you will listen to us, whether you want to or not kind of a way. And that is not something that we talked about when I was a public interest student at HLS, and it's certainly not the way people talk about community organizing and the sort of law and organizing tradition, but it really is much messier and much cruder, and that was sort of Moof's point. And so this, we read Moof the first time 5 years ago, and now many years later, she's still sort of kicking around there in the back of my head and making me think about my work. And again, it's hard to exactly say how it's shaped the nature of my work, but it's certainly shaped how I think about it, and probably is influencing my practice in ways that I don't even fully know how to articulate.
That's a great example. And I'll share an example also of something that I read as an intern in the first year and then reread this past summer. We read a chapter from Foucault's Discipline and Punish on delinquency, illegalities and delinquency. And it's sort of unusual for Summer Theory Institute because it was explicitly talking about the criminal justice system, but it was talking about it sort of so long ago that it didn't feel directly connected to our work today just because it was criminal justice. When I read it, when I participated, 5.5 years ago, I was struck, I think a lot of the students are who read it for the first time, with a concept called utopian duplication. So in the chapter, Foucault was talking about how the rise of the prison state depends in part on the presence of reformers, that reformers are actually part of the prison state and part of what allows the prison state to keep on going. So the fact that there are people being they're too punitive, they're not safe enough, they're not giving the right medical care, they're not reforming properly, the presence of people doing that type of advocacy in some way is as much a part of the prison system as walls and cages. So that, I think, for a lot of public interest students, practitioners, interns, that's a deep kind of thing. And I think especially since I was interested in being a public defender, it's something I really struggle with, right? You don't want to be a cog in the wheel of this machine that you think is so unjust. And in some way, by being there, by going along with at least some of the rules they lay down, you are. And that was pretty depressing to me. And so during my internship summer, I really tried to think through, and have partially made peace with, though not entirely, what I want in an office, how subversive I want it or can expect it to be within the bounds of being a public defender's office. So the office that I work at has a very irreverent approach to the court process. We will file losing motions, we will go with losing theories if it's the right thing to do in a certain narrow context. We will provide better representation than the court system can expect. We'll win trials we should lose. And then outside of the court process, this is the part that I thought was special, that I saw and that made me attracted to where I'm working now, is we deal with our clients and with all the problems they present with, right? When they walk into our office, they're not a criminal defendant who we're representing. They are a person with lots of stuff going on, one of which is a criminal case. So we have immigration lawyers, housing lawyers, we help them get public benefits, we'll help them get back into high school, we'll connect them with social workers. And for me, personally, that was enough to make me feel more positive about my decision. But I thought that was kind of a really well-phrased articulation of something that I think we all need to really struggle with. You know, to what extent are we just sort of mitigating the guilt that the rest of society should feel for the systems that are in place? To what extent are we putting band-aids on bigger problems? And I thought that was a really valuable thing to struggle with. When I reread it this past summer with our group, a different thing sort of jumped out at me. Foucault talks a lot about the creation of delinquency, how with the rise of the prison state, there was a class of people labeled as delinquent, and that label was reinforced by all the power structures of society. And the people labeled delinquent, like he gives this image of the sort of prisoner chain gang passing through the towns, they actually adopted that on themselves and almost aggravated that their manifestation of that identity as delinquent. So for me, since I was even more immersed in practice than I had been in my internship, I started to think differently about how am I talking to my clients, how am I presenting information about my clients in a way that might be reinforcing this idea of delinquency. And one thing really jumped out to me, which is that often in individual advocacy, you end up doing this sort of awkward, in some ways terrible thing where you try to explain to the prosecutor, to the judge, to the jury why your client is different. Yes, he's a 16-year-old black man from the Bronx, but he has a supportive family, but he does well in school, but he's great at basketball, but he, and you have this narrative of exceptionalism. That's a big part of what we do. And it really, reading Foucault and kind of being in the midst of that, brought out to me the broader damage that can do, right? Like reinforcing this idea that, yeah, there is this class of delinquents, my kid isn't one of them. How even doing really positive work can sometimes reinforce these negative ideas. And it got me thinking also, what if I'm telling a narrative about my client, but he recognizes this sort of like falsity to it? Then in some way, I'm like, listen, I'm gonna say that you're different because XYZ is in some way saying to him, you're not different, I see you as part of this group of delinquents, and like what damage is that doing, and how can I address that? So after that, I started having some more open sort of strategic conversations with my clients. Oh, I think a great example of this is I had one client with serious mental health issues, and he was accused of assaulting his girlfriend with very serious mental health issues. They met in a youth psychiatric hospital. And my theory was gonna be, she's crazy, she's lying, right? And I really struggled with how do I talk to my client about that theory? Do I see if he's comfortable with that? And how do we kind of strategize around it? And that was sort of at the same time as I was doing this thinking. And I can't say I got to the answer, but I had a very honest conversation with this client about what it means to present mental illness as negative. What do I really think about it? What does he really think about it? And I think that having this sort of perspective was really, really helpful in having those conversations. So I guess all that to say that some of these readings make things a lot messier, but I think you get a lot deeper. So that was a good example for me.
Great. So maybe we'll kind of stop a little bit and then open it up for sort of questions and discussion. All of this is to say that it's not this like sounds so corny, but like it's not about the answers, it's about asking the questions, and like that's sort of the point of this whole endeavor from the practitioner reading group to the Summer Theory Institute. You should do Summer Theory Institute if you haven't done it already, so sign up for it. Cara's email is up there, she'll do a plug later too. But you should also, if you imagine yourself practicing in a place where there isn't a Summer Theory Institute or a practitioner reading group, create it. Like figure out you don't have to like participate in pre-existing group activities, right? It's like about taking the risk of sort of figuring out what it is that you need to be the best public interest lawyer, the most supported public interest lawyer, to have the community around you that's going to ask the hard questions and push and prod you. And maybe it's not theory. A lot of people say, well, what about poetry? What if you did a poetry group and then talked about that in the context of practice? Great, maybe that'll work as well. But the real idea here is about forcing yourself to push and ask the difficult questions in the context of your practice, because they'll come up anyway. And having a framework for being able to think through them and process them is important, and build the community. Cara talked about the importance of that as a new lawyer. It is so important as a mid-career person, as I am right now, is to have the folks who can say, this thing happened at my work, and how do you kind of process it in the context of the broader issues that we're working on. So I can start by saying some of the things that we've done. We're actually trying to create sort of like not quite Summer Theory Institutes, but sort of mini conversations within the workplace as well. So in both of the organizations I've worked in, there are lawyers and organizers and sort of non-legal advocates that are in the mix. And so we would get together either over lunch or afterwards for drinks, and would actually have some sort of writing or reflective piece that we would then use as the starting point for conversation about our model as an organization, about our roles, like to sort of have the same kind of dialogue and actually get people talking to each other who were not talking to each other before because their work didn't always overlap. So that's one strategy. I'll channel Jocelyn for a second and say that Bronx Defenders, where she also worked, she had created a sort of similar discussion group and kind of, I guess, like work sessions on reflecting on race in public defense. And from what she has told me, it was pretty, to some extent, controversial, right? Because of the dynamic of, we're public defenders, of course we get racial justice, of course we get racial inequality, but then starting to unpack actually as a lawyer of privilege, like, how does that, like starting to really get people into an uncomfortable space about whether you really get it or not, I think helped in the longer term, from what I've heard from her, be able to open up some of those dialogues, some of those conversations, and then also continuing to do that with law students so that the internship experiences in the workplace are not these like, write the legal memo, now write another legal memo, great, see you at the end of the summer when we do your evaluation. Like actually having it be a more holistic, a more integrated, more sort of realizing that theory and conversation and reflection can be part of the day-to-day of practice for the interns and students who are practicing in your workplace, I think is really important in cultivating a different sort of culture. But those are just a couple of ideas. It could be a million other things.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that sort of along the lines of the idea of like day in the life of a client, something that my workplace sometimes does is have like volunteer projects, non-legal volunteer projects, something like that, getting people out of the office and serving in a different way. I think gets people thinking a little bit differently. I also this summer I'm taking over this reading group, and we're going to turn it into something a little more controversial, probably not too controversial, but and going to invite lawyers to that. And I do think it's important to develop some allies in your workplace that you think are people that you feel safe and comfortable critiquing things that you see. I don't mean like bitching, which is something that I think all lawyers do, and I think that's healthy too, like, oh, this happened in court, oh, this happened, this sucks. But I mean, people that you think you can talk to about it. But I think, I feel like to really, really dig deep on this, it's actually really important to go outside of your workplace, and at least this type of thinking. I think it's, you really learn a lot from not just talking to people in your own setting. But I do think it's an important thing for public interest lawyers to keep on trying to push at the boundaries of the organizations that they're in, to live out the values that they believe in. And I think even having some conversations about that, about you're not necessarily going to rewrite your organization's mission statement, but like looking at it and seeing how people feel about that, like what kind of goals are there things you would want to add. I think kind of having some of those foundational conversations is good, though I think within your workplace is not necessarily the safest, freest place to have the types of conversations that we're talking about, even in a progressive organization. I would just say I think community is so incredibly important. There's a wonderful public interest community here now. I think, at least from when, that's how I felt when I was here. I know Nisha and Jocelyn felt like it was maybe less so, and I think it's been developing to be richer and stronger over the years. And I know you all know this, but I would definitely say that your colleagues here are going to be just tremendous, tremendous resources as you practice. And of course, it's not just an HLS thing. All of your, all the public interest lawyers you come across, all the public interest advocates who are not lawyers will also be great resources. But I think we should all try to keep on thinking how to develop that sense of community and identity while you're here. It's a really fortunate, privileged place to be. And I think having that community will be what helps all of us stick in it for the long run, which I hope we do.
I agree with that, and I think building relationships, 90% of my job is relationships, 10% of it is lawyering, if you can even characterize it as that, right? So the proportions shift dramatically in terms of how much time you spend thinking about law and how much time you spend thinking about people when you are actually in the workplace, even if you practice private sector law. It's really about the relationships and the community, however you define that. So I totally emphasize that and agree with that. And if you, I guess maybe we can close by saying if you're looking for, again, Summer Theory Institute, you can email Cara about that. If you're
Got
looking,
some info sheets to print it out, so feel free to take some. I'll leave them up here for you guys.
if you're interested in thinking more about some of these theory practice questions, Jocelyn and I have an article on Summer Theory Institute that we had written, and there are hard copies here for you to grab if you are at all interested. And if you're interested in internships in law and organizing, I have my cards here. We're based in New York, Center for Popular Democracy. Would love to talk to folks about that as well.
Yeah, so I have my work email and my personal email up there. If you want to have any questions about Summer Theory Institute, feel free to email me at my Gmail address. Any questions about work, either. We're going to be doing this again this summer. It's going to be awesome. If you're not going to be in New York but are interested in seeing our reading list, shoot me an email also, and I'm happy to share with you what we're planning to do.
I just want to say this is, I've been doing this with you for 4 years now, and this conversation is by far the most compelling one I think we've talked about the program. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank both of our speakers today for.